Yosef interpreted the dreams of the wine steward and the baker. And he said to the wine steward, after the wine steward realized that the interpretation was correct, as it says in Chazal, that each one of the stewards had dreamt the interpretation of the other's dream. So the baker, when he heard the interpretation of the Sarah Mashkim's dream, he knew it was correct. So Yosef had made a request of him that when you will be reinstated into your post as wine steward, remember me and mention me. That was his request. Which was, and it says, Vayishkacheu. The wine steward, when he was reinstated, he forgot about Yosef. He never considered even mentioning him. I mean, the whole concept of appreciation, Hakoras HaTov, to be able to have a sense of beholdenness to Yosef didn't exist. And as a result of that, he remained in prison, in the dungeon. So the Medrash tells us that because he said those two words were considered a lack of faith, he spent 2 more years in the dungeon. He was 10 years in the dungeon, but because of those 2 words, which he asked, remember me and mention me, he spent another 2 years. And therefore, this portion begins, and when 2 years passed, exactly, Paro begins dreaming at this moment, because now it's time for the release. And how is Yosef going to be released from prison? The wine steward all of a sudden now is going to reveal that there was this Jew in prison, whatever it is, he has this ability to interpret dreams, and immediately he's summoned, and he interprets the dream, and this is his rise immediately to power. He becomes the viceroy of Egypt, literally instantaneously, relatives instantaneously. So Ernie asked, what was so wrong? What did he do so terribly? He asked, evidently it was considered a lack of faith. So the way the question's asked, we know in life, we always have to take initiative. Take initiative. And if you take initiative, she took initiative. Here an opportunity to hold the wine steward accountable or beholding. So he made the request. I've done you this favor, help me out. So why is it considered a claim against him? So the Medrash quotes a pasuk in Tehillim that a person does not put his faith in Rehovim. The Egyptians are called Rehovim. What's Rehovim mean? People who have in these pagans. You don't referring specifically to the Egyptians. The Egyptians, they have no sense of appreciation. Therefore, it's considered like an act of desperation. Asking the wine steward to remember him was asking a person where there wasn't a chance whatsoever to any degree that this man's going to have any level of appreciation. So Yosef being so wise and being able to evaluate a person, wanted to see it himself. The answer is because Yosef was desperate. Hishtadlus is only within the context that there's a chance it may work. But if there's no chance it will ever work, because the person doesn't have capacity to appreciate as much as an iota, so why did Yosef read it so wrong? Because when a person is desperate, he doesn't think rationally, and that's why he had made this request of the wine steward. For Yosef to be in a state of desperation, this was considered a lack of faith, but a circumstance that he was there another more than 10 years, that he was in that state, it caused him to be in a state of desperation. And the Chazon Ish explains it's like a person is drowning and there's water, and there's straw floating on the surface of the water, and you grab the straws to try to hold you up where you're sinking, where you're drowning. That's called grasping at straws. Grasping at straws is classified as an act of desperation. Yosef, because of the circumstance, he was in a state of desperation, therefore was a claim against him, and that was why it was considered a lack of faith. If it would have been another person, another type of person, it would have been hishtadlus. It was a correct act. You take initiative. You take the initiative, Hashem brings about the result. But here, because of his state of desperation, he didn't see it right, and therefore he asked the person, there wasn't a chance ever that this man would have any degree of appreciation. And we'll see, even when the Sarah Mashkin, he finally piped up, it was only because he was concerned that it would be found out that why was he released from prison? What happened? Because there was somebody who had the ability to interpret his dreams. So if he would remain silent and not share with Paro that there's such a person, because we can see in a moment, he went to all the dream interpreters, Paro in Egypt, and nobody could give him a proper interpretation. If Paro would have found out that there's such a person, he would have had the Sarah Mashkin's head. Therefore, even when he did divulge it, we'll see in a moment, he divulged it in a way that was in the most detestable, deprecating way, not to give Yosef a chance to have any sense of value in the eyes of Paro, as we'll discuss in a moment. Chazonish explains with an allegory, a person is being chased by a rabid dog, and you run, and there's no way you can outchase that dog. To be able to come to a point where you're in a safe place and you run, rather than stop and pray, what is it considered? It's a lack. It's called desperation. Because if there's no way you can outrun the dog while you're running, your only avenue of being saved, not to be bitten, is by being mispalo. You should pray. But if a person could run and save himself, and to reach a safe location, and he stops and prays, the man's a fool. Because since he's in a position that he could save himself by taking that initiative, he's doing the wrong thing by stopping and praying, because it's within his ability to save himself. That's when Hishtadlus initiative has value. And it was at the end of 2 years, literally 2 years to the moment. Paro begins dreaming. He's standing by the Yor. Rashi explains, what is the Yor? The Yor, they were like tributaries. The Nile was the river, and the Nile, when it would rise, it would fill these irrigation ditches in the fields, and that's how the fields were actually irrigated. So Rashi himself says, Ayor, Kosher Noris Enekruim Yorim, Chutz Milos. The only other rivers are not called Yor, except the Nile. Neshkol Eretz Asuyim, Yorim Bidei Odom. You have all these irrigation ditches, which are man-made. Venilos Ola B'tocho Mashkosam. The Nile rises, and that's how the fields become irrigated. Because in Egypt, it doesn't rain. So they have to have this irrigation system where the river flows into the fields. And how does it flow into the fields? It fills in these ditches. And as a result of that, the water seeps into the fields, and that's the way the fields are irrigated. Okay? And behold, seemingly the word behold seems to be superfluous. So over here, the Rabbeinu Bachya explains the word behold means it was at a level of clarity that Paro knew that this wasn't just a dream of something he had thought about. He experienced it as if the reality he was experiencing, seeing actually what actually he was dreaming. There were 7 poros, Yifos Maro, Ubrios Boso, good looking, heavily fleshed, the Terenu Bochu, and they were grazing in the marshes. And behold, there were 7 other cows ascending from the Yor after the first 7, bad looking, thin fleshed. And they stood alongside the first 7, the second alongside the first 7. Let's take a look at Rashi. What is the significance of this? Ultimately, the way Yosef will interpret the dreams. Yifos Mare, Simru Limei Sova. Yifos Mare, the word Mare, people have a positive eye. Simru Limei Sova, Shabrios, Niros Yofazuluzu. When there's plenty, people, the interaction is very, very positive. Meaning there's enough for everyone. There's such a level of bounty. People are not envious. There's no envy. There's only envy when one person is lacking, has less than the other.
South Bay Cliffs, and Henry Hudson Parkway, South Manhattan.
Somebody's okay. Alan, is that you? Okay. But if everybody, there's such plenty, people not, there's no envy. So therefore, the Yefos Mare, each one looks at the other person in a positive way. Nobody's looking to the other person's pot. No one's eye is narrow regarding the other one, because no one has less than the other. There's such a level of abundance. That's the significance of the good-looking cows. Bochu Bagam. You know, the whole concept of Ayin Hora, spoke about it. Ephron had Ayin Ra, right? The gematria, the miracle value of Ephron without the Vav is Ayin Ra. 400 is Ayin Ra. And the Gemara speaks at length about Ayin Hora. When do people have an evil eye? If a person feels that someone has more than him, especially then, this causes envy, and therefore you look at the other person with his jaundiced eye. But if there's such overwhelming abundance, as we'll see, when during the 7 years of plenty, there was such abundance, people were so preoccupied just bringing it all in. The wealth, nobody had any time to look at anyone else. I always say that, you know, the United States of America was the land of plenty. There was tremendous bracha in the United States, more than Europe, more than anywhere in the world, because there was such plenty in America. It was the land of the free, and there was such endless bracha. There was less envy, and because there was less envy, that's the reason why there was such bracha in the United States, and that's why it boomed in many levels. Every resource that was needed existed here. The agriculture, the mining, everything was self-contained here in the United States, and they opened the lands and they kept going, and there was no end to it. Therefore, there was bracha in the United States because the Yefos Mare. People saw each other in a positive way rather than feel denied and the other person had more than him. Dakos Bosor. Okay. Dalid. V'tochalno aporos ros hamare v'dakos habosor. And the bad-looking cows, which were thin-fleshed, they ate a sheva porosayofas hamare vabrios. They ate the 7 cows that were good-looking and that were healthy. Vayiketz Paro. Paro awoke from his dream. What's tochalno? Simin shteikol simchas hasova dishkachas b'meorov. Yeah, that the joy of the sova, of the plenty, will be forgotten in the days of famine. The famine is going to be so extreme that all they'll be able to focus on, there won't be a remnant, a trace of that original that plenty. You know, a person, at least he has fond memories. The level of lack of food is going to be so painful that they're not going to have even a fond memory. You know, sometimes you find solace in a fond memory of the past. There's not even a fond memory here. That's how painful the famine is going to be. Tochalno, to be swallowed up. But it's interesting, he says, Simchas Harov, Simchas HaSova. He doesn't say the sofa. The Simchas HaSova, the joy of those years of plenty, those good years. If you take a look at the Sefarno, it says, initially the cows, they stood next to one another. And then it says they devoured them, they ate them. So the Sefarno says, Kodim shetoklena osono, lahoro shi harov asova yachta bezizman. Before the famine took effect fully, what does that mean? The famine existed, he says, Kinyin virov b'chol harotzos. All the other lands outside of Egypt, the famine already struck. They didn't have. Egypt still had bread. they still had remnants of the plenty. So there were two things, they existed simultaneously. Outside of Egypt, they were experiencing the famine. In Egypt, they still had food, they still had bread. And then afterwards, even Egypt had nothing. The only thing they had was what Yosef stored away. The Orach HaKodesh explains, very often, I remember I had a grandmother, Aleh Shalom, she was a very wise woman. And coming from Europe and being born in the late 1800s, she used to say to I had an uncle who was a man of means, who wasn't so observant. And she used to say, you have to save for a rainy day. You just can't spend just because you have good years. Spend because you never know. Things could turn, and you have to have a reserve. You have to save for a rainy day. That's what she used to tell him always. Because if you know what it means not to have, and things you saw in your life, how things change, you have to save for a rainy day. That's the way it is. So Orach HaKodesh writes over there was such plenty during the 7 years of famine. During the years of plenty, the Egyptians could not believe in their wildest dreams that things could get bad, where there's not going to be a trace of what they were experiencing now. They had such plenty. So unless they were forced, there was somebody who would oversee the collection of food and storing it away, the people would have actually consumed everything, and there would have been nothing left for the years of famine. So Yosef's genius was to set up a system that the government would actually collect food and store it away, whether the people liked it or not, because the people themselves, as much as you tell them what's coming down the pike, they're not going to believe that to be reality. How could it be we have you're drowning in wealth, in such abundance, that it could change so quickly? But it changed that quickly. It did change. It's only because Yosef had advised Paro to set up the system of storage. That's the reason why Egypt survived. Not only did it survive, all the wealth of the world actually came to Egypt for that reason. It's very interesting. We went to Egypt because of what? Because of the Bris Bein Absorim, the competition between the parts. You'll be enslaved in a land which is not yours. You'll be afflicted, and afterwards you will go out with great wealth. That's what Hashem had said to Avraham Avinu. That's the Bris Bein Absorim. The wealth, untold wealth we left with. Now, during the years of famine, they gathered all the wealth of the world. They depleted all the wealth of the world. Everything came to Egypt, because if they wouldn't purchase the food, they had no food. Egypt believed that what? They were the wealthiest country in the world, and went into the government's reserves. And that was the financial backbone of the country. That was the security. But they didn't know that they're just the bankers for the Jews, that in 210 years, when the Jews leave, all this wealth is being taken out of Egypt. So what they believed to be theirs was really only in reserve for us. That we left Egypt, as it says, it was like Mitzul Shebo Chito. We left, we didn't leave anything. There was nothing left there. Because especially after when they went out with the chariots, that was the government's wealth. The chariots were bedecked with gold, silver, and diamonds. And it says the Bizas Hayam, the spoils of the sea, were even greater than the spoils they took out of Egypt. But all that was part of Akech Yetzer Chush Gadol. And ultimately for the building of the Mishkan, because they needed that degree of wealth. It's very interesting. So why was there a famine? There was plenty, there was a famine. The famine was, so ultimately, of course, Yaakov came. He could have come to Egypt other ways. That all the wealth of the world should come to Egypt. So after 210 years, when we leave with a wealth, which is one kind of wealth. And we had that wealth until the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. That wealth remained with us till the Churban Bayis Rishon. After the Bayis Rishon, then it went to Bavel. The Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, he took that wealth. And when Babel was destroyed, it went somewhere else. And ultimately, the Romans, they had the wealth. It passed from civilization to civilization. So Hashem orchestrated the Rov, the famine, in a way that ultimately that wealth should be there for us to leave Egypt with that wealth. He went to sleep, and he dreamt again a second time. Brios v'tovos. He had 7 stalks or sheaves growing on one stalk, healthy and good looking. Again, brios vitovos. Vide shevishi bolim, dako shtuvas kodim. 7 sheaves, thin, wind-blown, meaning they were like, the kernels were blown out by the easterly wind, growing right after them. And the shibolim hadakos, the thin sheaves, swallowed up the 7 sheaves habrios hamleos that were healthy looking and filled with kernels. Vigats paro v'idei chalom. Paro awoke, and the dream was completed. Just one moment. I mean, there are differences here. I mean, just to see when it speaks about the yeah, no, when it speaks about the swallowing up, it doesn't mention the number any longer. Right? In terms of the thin one swallowing up, it says the thin one swallowed the 7. First, it says 7 row came afterwards. When it spoke with the 7, it only speaks about the 7, the healthy ones being swallowed up, the number. But the ones that doing the swallowing doesn't mention a number, right? The thin fleshed cows swallow up the 7 healthy cows. The 7 the sheaves, which were windblown, swallowed the 7. Again, the 7's in speaking of the healthy ones. Okay. Pine chalom, hine nishlom chalom sholem lefonav v'hutzach posrim. Now that he finished dreaming, Paro now needs a dream interpreter. He needs an interpretation. So over here, the Sefarno explains, Paro understood this was one dream, that the first part of the dream was related to the second part of the dream. Although the first part of the dream were cows and the second were the sheaves. So here he says, he realized it's all one dream. It's one message being communicated. The first one, he was standing by the Nile and he saw the cows. He was standing in that same location, and from that same location, the same setting, he saw the sheaves, the healthy sheaves, the good-looking sheaves, and then the wind-blown sheaves. As a result of he understood, since it was the same setting, it's one dream. So he wanted to know, there were nuances of difference, but it's one dream. His spirit was clanging, meaning it's something he couldn't deal with until he had some clarity on this. Like you have the clangor in the bell, it keeps moving. That's when his spirit was actually was unsettled. Here it says vatipoim grammatically. There's one tough by Nebuchadnezzar. He had a dream. This is Daniel interpreted his dream as vatispoim rucho. He knew he had a dream because we'll see in a moment. Nebuchadnezzar, when he had a dream, he knew he dreamt. He couldn't even remember the dream. Paro remembered the dream. He just needs an interpretation of the dream. So it was different. He needed a different level of clarity. Paro needed a clarity just to interpret the dream. Nebuchadnezzar, he knew he dreamt something which had significance. He couldn't recall it. And even when he was recalled, when he was told what it was, he still didn't understand what it was. Shichas hachalom v'halom espisrono. Vahi baboker Vatipom rucha vatishlach, vayishlach vayikra eskol turme mitzrayim eskol chachamel. He called all the soothsayers of Egypt, the ones who have to do with witchcraft, the sorcerers, and all its wise men. The Yisapep lehem paro lehem es chalomo ve'pososim leparo. He told over his dream. Paro told him his dream, and no one offered interpretation was satisfactory to Paro. They gave many interpretations, but Paro understood that wasn't the correct interpretation. He had that sense. Chatume, he says, "Ein posas lo Paro, posim hoyu osam." The people they had interpretations. Avlo the Paro shlo yakol nichnas beoznov, v'lo lo koras ruach b'shronim. Their interpretations did not enter into his ears, meaning they were not receptive. He was not receptive because he had no what? It had no value to him because he had no peace. She'omrim sheva bonus atomolded. You're gonna have 7 daughters. Sheva bonus atokover. You're gonna bury those 7 daughters. Totally rejected it. It's not what it's about. We mentioned initially Yosef was only meant to be 10 years in the dungeon. He spent another 2 years because of his lack of faith, that he had said 2 words to the Saramashkim, and therefore he was an additional 2 years. He was 12 years. And when the time was up, Paro immediately begins dreaming because that's the basis for his release and his rise to power. If he wouldn't have failed in this area, he would have been there 2 years earlier. 2 years earlier, he would have been there. Now, why was he there 10 years? And why, for every word, did he spend another year? So we once mentioned a Maral. The Maral of Prague explains that when Moshe Rabbeinu came to Egypt and he performed miracles for the Jews to prove that he was the Shliach Hashem, that he was God's agent and he's the Redeemer, the Torah tells us, Vayamin ha'om. The people believed. He performed 3 miracles, if you remember. Right? 3 miracles. And it says, Vayamin ha'om. The people believed that he was God's agent to take him out of Egypt. So when it says Vayamin ha'om, the Maral cites a midrash, Miyad poska shibut. From that moment that it says they believed, the shibut, the bondage, ceased at that moment. So Maral asks, what is believing that he's the Redeemer? Why is that a basis that the bondage should stop at that moment? So the Maral explains that's what's the difference between the spiritual realm and the physical realm. In the physical realm, everything functions and exists within the context of cause and effect. There's cause and effect. In the spiritual realm, which is we talk about the world to come, whatever exists, once it exists, it continues. It continues. It doesn't in any way deteriorate, doesn't dissipate, it just continues. He gives an example. You have a fresh baked piece of bread. Over time, the bread starts getting stale because of exposure to the environment, and ultimately, it'll turn back to dust because that's part of the deterioration process, because it's affected by its makeup and what it's exposed to. Spiritual, there's no effect. It comes into existence. One exists and it continues to exist. The whole concept of influence, the outside influence, has no relevance to the spiritual. So he explains it this way. We say, the Rambam writes in Hilchot, he doesn't bring the Rambam, of course, the Maral doesn't cite the Rambam, but he says, I'm telling you, the Rambam writes in Hilchot Deos that there's only creature in existence that is affected by its environment is the human being. Every other creature is what it is because that's what God created. That's his DNA. It functions only the way it's meant to function. The human being, based on what the human being is exposed to, that has a tremendous influence on the behavior and the function of that person. Therefore, the Rambam writes that if a person finds himself in an environment which is not conducive for spirituality, or even has a negative effect, you have to leave that environment. You have to leave to go to a community with the tzaddikim, the devoutly righteous people, people who have belief, so on and so forth. And if you can't, because the traveling situation is dangerous, even if you have to go live in a desert, you go into a desert or into a cave, because ultimately the environment will affect you. That's a human being. So human being, that's part of choice. Where you put yourself, that's the way. That's the levels of influence. That's the Rambam. So if you live in a pagan society and you're the slaves, there's no person who's more influenced than a slave by the master. So we were pagans. All of a sudden, Moshe comes. Shows he's the Redeemer, and says they believe. All of a sudden, they're getting a glimpse that it's not paganism. That Moshe is representing the Almighty, the monotheistic being. As a result of that, they were unaffected by the influence. They were no longer influenced. Once you're no longer influenced, the whole concept, what's the concept of bondage? Bondage means your master controls your life, every aspect of your life. Your physicality is dictated by the master. Ultimately, your thought process is dictated by the master. Your totality is, he explains, why we were in Egypt. We meant to be there 400 years, because the number 4 represents total opposition. When a person is surrounded on all 4 sides, you're totally opposed. Your totality is entombed in that state of slavery. That's where you are. If you're able to break out of that and not be influenced by that, that itself is a spiritual characteristic. Being affected is that's a physical characteristic. Being unaffected, that's a spiritual characteristic. Therefore, when it says Vayamein, it says they believed, they assumed a spiritual posture. Once they believed, they no longer were affected for that moment by the beliefs of their masters. Poska shibud, the bondage ceased immediately. Because a shibud is only someone who's affected. They already demonstrated that people are no longer affected. Once you're not an affected person, the bondage ceased at that moment. That's the morale of Prague. So I said, why did Yosef spend 10 years in the dungeon? So it says in the Gemara, in Sota, that when the wife of Potiphar tried to seduce him, and although he fled, we mentioned he lost 10 droplets of semen. And if he wouldn't have lost those droplets of semen, Yosef would have had 12 children. And the 12 children would have been 12 tribes. As Ephraim and Manasseh were 2 of the tribes, he was the equivalent of his father, as we said, in every aspect of it, Yosef. And that's why, although he was a son, his children were tribes. So for every droplet of semen that he lost, he spent a year in the dungeon. Because to what degree was he affected by this woman? He was affected to the degree 10 droplets. Because he was affected 10 droplets, for each droplet is a year in prison. Now he's there 10 years. All of a sudden now he interprets the dreams. He failed. He should have had faith and understood that here he's barking up the wrong tree. And he was grasping at straws. So to what degree was he affected due to his desperation? He said 2 words. Schartani viskartani. Remember me and mention me. Because he was affected to that degree, spent another 2 years in prison. As a result of it, once the 2 years are up, now you're ready for the release. The Maral, Moshe Rabbeinu, the Torah tells us he lived till 120 years, and the Torah gives us a description of his physicality. That although he was 120 years old, lo noslecho, lo koseino, his vibrancy, his virility, his eyesight, he was in perfect health, perfect, like a young person. What's the Torah telling us this? What do we need a health update on Moshe Rabbeinu's physical condition? So he explains the morale, because Moshe Rabbeinu lived a life of totally spirituality. He was unaffected his whole life. He was never affected. Part of the aging process is because we're affected by our environment. Moshe Rabbeinu was so spiritualized, he was an unaffected person. Being unaffected, there's no effect. The aging process doesn't set in. Even though he looked like a person of 120 years old, but health-wise, vibrancy-wise, every sense of the word, he was like a young man. because he was a person who was unaffected. He affected but was unaffected. That's the morale. The wine steward speaks to Paro, Lamor, saying, I admit my chatoy, my sins today. What are the sins? I mean, it's the Gemara tells us why was he initially imprisoned? Because Paro had found a fly in his wine. Okay? So what do you mean? It's almost like arrogance. I mean, initially I felt I was innocent, and it was something I didn't deserve the prison sentence. But now I admit my sins. I mean, what are you talking about? He's saying what Paro did something wrong to you. That itself is totally insubordination. How do you make such a comment? I admit my sins today.
He has to say that.
Why does he have to say that?
Because Paro did imprison him, and if he's saying that Paro, I didn't do anything wrong, he didn't have to imprison me, off with your head.
Exactly. So over here, the Sephardo addresses this question, this problem. He says, "Loki Misraim al Shunosata Osi Beis Soar." He didn't come with a claim, with a complaint. You put me in prison, and only now I admit I sinned. But until now, I believed I didn't deserve it. He's just saying that I just want to recap, review exactly what happened. I want to remind the king of my original sin. But he's not coming with a complaint that I never sinned. I didn't deserve the original sentence. But what he's saying is, I appreciate, you see, the so-called the providence. This was all meant to be, so I should be there. So I should meet this person who has this ability to interpret dreams. So Paro's decision to put me in prison, it was meant to be, and it was meant that I should sin. I should fail on my post as the wine steward, so that I should meet this person and have this experience, the dream and how he interpreted my dream. And he gives the whole recap. Paro chotzav alavodov. Paro was angry with his subjects. Veyitin osi b'mishum beisara tabochim, osi beisara ofim. In the mishmar, in the prison of the Sarah Tabochim, question what Sarah Tabochim means. The executioner, or mean the meat purveyor. Okay, I'm just going to skip a little bit here. Posuk Beis. The Shami Tonu Nar Evid, Nar Ivri Evid Sarah Tabochim, and there in prison with us there was a Nar, a Hebrew, Eved l'Sarah Tabochim, a slave to the Sarah Tabochim, to the minister of whatever it means, either the executioner or the meat purveyor. We told over our dream, and he interpreted our dreams. Each of us, it was interpreted correctly, because it happened. Kashi kashe posar lonu kein hoyo. As he interpreted, it's exactly what happened. Osi heishav al kani. I was reinstated to my position, to my post, and he was hanged. Vayishlach Paro v'yikra Yosef. Paro immediately sends and he calls Yosef. They rush him out of the pit, the dungeon. V'yigalach, he was groomed. V'yichalish simosov v'yavol Paro. They changed his clothing, and he was brought to Paro. You know what this is? You know how the Gula is going to happen. Mashiach, Yeshua Hashem Kerafayin. The salvation of God will come like a blink of an eye. It's going to go from one level to another almost instantaneously. Here, Yosef is rotting in a dungeon, and in a moment, he rises to a level of power which is more powerful than Paro. It's unheard of, but it's exactly what's going to happen at the end of time. Yeshua Hashem, when we reach the level of deprecation, of lowliness, but when we reach that, we're going to go soar to the highest level that the world will recognize us as being the chosen people. And we're going to be the dominant ones in the world. That's how quickly it's going to change. Take a look over here. If you have a Seforno, Kederach Kol Shuas Hashem, as every time the salvation of Hashem happens, Shenasis Kmorega, it happens in a moment. Kamro Kikrovi Shuasi Lovo. Yeshaya Navi says, my Yeshua is about to happen. Chomrulo Abi Shomeali Kimat Oive Machria. In a moment, I will subordinate your enemies. Kachoye Inyan Mimtzrayim. How do we leave Egypt? Here, Paro saying you're not leaving under any circumstance. Ki Goshim, we were driven out of Egypt. It's to the point that the dough didn't have time to become leaven, didn't rise. That's how quickly. Here, we're slaves, you're not leaving. In a moment, Paro is not even tolerating us to be there for a moment. Chen Omar Lasus Losid. Kamro Upisom, quotes Posuk Malachi. Upisom Yovo Lecholo Odom. Instantaneously, the Odom will come to a sanctuary. There's the Binyan by Shlishi. Immediately, suddenly, the Odom, the master, will come to his Heichel. That's going to happen. It's late.
So, are we supposed to